I guess it's a little bit of a reflection and a little bit of sort of background information on design, and we come from the word innovation, which is a very big buzzword at the moment, and then we start to say, well, what does that mean? And we immediately get to the concept of design, which has been around for a bit longer than the innovation concept. So I'm assuming most of the people here are in the mostly medical background, not so much engineering or business. Is that right? Anyone else in? So there's 2 engineers there, and yeah, and anybody in business, probably not so much. To start it off, I'll just do a little bit of background. Some of you are probably familiar about the design thinking and design processes world, so I won't bore you too much with details on that, but I just thought this is a nice slide. And these 3 words are quite interesting: the viability of a new product, the feasibility, and the desirability. So you basically, when you're innovating in a new product, we often think about the technology. Basically, what can we do with new devices? What is the new technologies that are coming on the horizon? How do we integrate them into ours? So maybe it's software, apps, hardware devices, all that kind of thing. But then you immediately go and look, do the people want it actually? And and that's often in our discussion today, it's more the medical side of things. Does it suit the user? Does it suit and then obviously the viability is, can you make someone pay for it? Otherwise, there's many great products that end up on the shelf that never get to market. This is a company called IDEO, who are quite famous in the design and thinking world, but they've put this together. And they basically look at the intersections of the different areas. So just a nice, you can see up at the top what they call emotional innovation, basically your branding and your marketing. I know in medical space, marketing and representation of the devices is a big thing. You see experience, okay, they're basically looking for the central kind of convergence of these things and balancing all those needs. So you can see there's a lot of different aspects to come into one product at the end of the day. So I thought I'll just start with that to get a bit of a context. And then this diagram, which is quite commonly bounced around, often it might have 7 or 6 different number of steps. But basically, if you want to take a new product, if you want to innovate and design a new product for the medical device space or medical space, you go through these phases. And let me just point like this. So to start with, you start to understand the customer. You come through to define the problem. You say, well, what problem am I trying to solve with this device? And then you brainstorm ideas on how to solve that problem. You can see that widening, and they use the word flare, but that's just basically letting things go a bit wild, and then prototyping and testing ideas back down to the solution that you're going for. So if you connect that to the old school engineering context, then we've got the word systems engineering, and you get people who are professional systems engineers, and they usually take this stage here from what we call the specification in engineering language across to ideate, prototype, and test. So they tend to assume that we know the customer, that we know what we want to build. Now, what I found in the last while building devices in the medical space is that it's often very difficult to decide what to build. So that early stage, which is often in engineering world, is left to the industrial designers, ergonomists, and basically the more people-centric, people factors-centric engineers. That becomes hugely more important and actually can take up a big amount of the time. If you stop and look at and think about the actual technology that is going into medicine, while there are some very high-tech products, a lot of times it lags in technology compared to, say, in automotive. The things they're putting in cars haven't yet come to medicine, because there's a much more focus on the people, and the technology has to be a little bit more conservative for safety reasons and compliance and all of those sorts of other things. And interestingly, the word empathy comes through there. You basically need to empathize with the customer, with the person who's going to pay and the person who's going to try and understand what really makes them tick. How can your device add value to their lives? And I was thinking about the word empathy in a clinical environment. You've got clinical care, right? You're feeling you are treating the patient, and you're trying to understand, you're trying to assess their needs. there's definitely an analogy there. Sometimes this process, that stage is a bit more removed from the, but there's a lot of observations and a lot of, so I think if you come from a medical background, you've got a good grounding in observations and seeing what people need. To that, you need to add the concept of imagination. Like imagine how this person's context can change if you were to add another technology or another product. So you might see someone in a rehabilitation setting and think, well, maybe looking for their for the problems that they're experiencing and seeing whether you feel like you could address those problems with the new technology. So there's lots more detail that can go into this. The other thing that I found is that specification that you're trying to get to can often, the engineers will talk about the spec, and it can really become a point of friction in the team, because engineers just want to see the spec and they want to build from something which is static. And then next week, a couple of months go by and the doctor says, no, I don't actually want that, I want something different. And the engineers base themselves on this foundation, and now that foundation is shifted. So there's quite a lot of potential problems basically that can come from that, and we just need to understand what the two different parties in the relationship are trying to do. So I think those are the main things about design thinking. This doesn't talk too much about business people, but you have to check that there's financial viability all the way along. And so then, if we think about the different types of medical products we can have, if we just use the European Union type of classification, we've got type 1, type 2A, type 2B, and type 3. So type 3 would be the most invasive, usually implantable devices like pacemakers, orthopaedic devices. But class 2A and 2B involve when you subject the body to outside energy. So if you were to use ultrasound, those kinds of devices, and then class 1 is the non-invasive, non-energy producing devices. So, and then even to the other end, doesn't even have a class yet, is this medical software, which I think a lot of people have been talking about in this context. Medical apps, medical patient handling, etc. There was this list runner, which was the last talk about how to. So from the software end, you've got very fast turnover of prototyping and trying new things, and even to the other end of that, you've got the business process, so clinical practice innovation. But I'm not going to go into that too much, but that's maybe something that gets done every day. That people are trying new ways of treating patients, of sorting them, of putting them into queues. I know there's lots of research going on into that, but that's much less regulated. You can try a lot of new things as long as there's a kind of ethical basis for it, whereas devices have to go through a bit more stringent process to get to market. In the South African environment, we've got examples of all these different types of devices being developed. Obviously, the ones with the class 3 devices are much more expensive, and they happen much more rarely. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later on. So I was working at the MRC for the past 2 years, and before I came to UCT, and I was involved in a whole range of devices, generally light sort of patient sensors, so testing blood pressure, spirometry, and then sort of surgical devices and more traditional medical devices. I'll just run you through a few of them, and I've got some examples here on the table. So if you're just looking at the projects, this is the one that I've got here. This is a previous version of it. Basically, we've got a standard cuff. So we were saying, well, in what way can we reuse existing technologies, which is the cuff and the cell phone or the PC that you've got in your clinical environment. This is a smartphone. And what's the cheapest way we can connect them and actually do the blood pressure calculation without and utilize as much of the resources as we've got. This might be called frugal innovation. That's a buzzword that's being used in that sense. Basically, it's what can you use from your existing technology. So we built this board to measure the pressure, and you pump it up using the traditional pump, and you read out the results on your phone. I can demonstrate it a bit later. Basically, we're trying to match the cheapest automatic blood pressure equivalent, but then you get for that same price, you get a lot more advantages. So the software can run in different languages. We've got five languages on this app so far, and it makes the ambulatory measuring a lot easier because it can the device can interact with the patient, can send them a message to say inflate your cuff and take another measure. So those 25,000 Rand ABPM devices which we have here at Groote Schuur and which often get lost and broken and need to be replaced can potentially be replaced with something quite a lot cheaper. So it opens a lot of questions. It doesn't solve the problem, but it basically says there might be new ways to do this. Let's see. And so this concept of measuring patients' vital signs using a very low-cost device is slowly coming and basically challenging some of the old sort of expensive equipment that we had. Another example, well, that's actually a surgical device that I worked on with it, which is for hip replacements for minimally invasive surgery. Then this is a primary care guideline that basically was a digitization of the Pulsar Plus. I don't know if you're familiar with the HIV guidelines, which became primary care guidelines across at the Lung Institute here. And the whole concept was to digitize these into a tablet form. Now, simple starting concept, but when you start thinking about rollout of tablets and rollout of touchscreens in a clinical environment, there's a huge amount of unknowns. And things like theft, things like how do you even hold it while you're dealing with a patient. Many different design questions came out, and I think that project actually showed a lot of the user end, because the technology is existing. It's just you get a PDF and you make an interactive PDF onto a tablet. It's fairly simple, but actually the user end of the things and the way it affects clinical practice was the biggest unknown in that. This is a mobile clinics project, which was basically user factors, like what is the comfortable user environment in the mobile clinic space. We can talk about that a bit more later if we need to. There's the umbilical blood flow Doppler, this is a very interesting project because it's been around for so long. Maybe you've heard of UmbiFlow. It started in 1996. And so it's a very long project, and so there's quite a lot of interesting learnings about how engineers and doctors work together and how this project can have kind of a life of its own. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Basically, it's a Doppler ultrasound device that measures the placental insufficiency, and the idea is to reduce the amount of referrals, unnecessary referrals to tertiary level care. This is mainly run at the CSIR up in Pretoria. This is very similar to the blood pressure device. It's a spirometer. We were trying to use the audio jack on the phone, and the innovation was to try and power the device with the audio jack. There's a very small amount of power you can pick up. I had a lot of technical problems because the power level is so low, but basically that design has been, the app exists, and we basically, that design could be taken further. It hasn't been managed to find more funding, but the concept is that you reuse one of these clinical little paddle wheels, which are about 15 Rand each. It's a disposable item, and then you put your own electronics around it and measure the lung function. Okay, so this was a project which is still ongoing, but it's become more of a software-only project. At the time, we started out with doing the triage. We wanted to do triage with a device like this blood pressure type of device. And the idea was to integrate all of these different, basically patient vital signs into the score, the South African triage score, which you can see. And the idea is to be able to triage someone much quicker than using a traditional, you're having to change your device, have a thermometer, having your blood pressure monitor, having your heart rate comes with the blood pressure monitor, and then the breathing rate, which is usually counting, which is there's often a lot of errors. So we thought, well, if we could get this all into one device, so the app exists now and has been with the two emergency medicine doctors which are running this, and the app exists, but we haven't. The hardware is not. The data is not being pulled from the hardware at this point. It's just being typed in, but they're seeing if they can get that to market. There was a project. This is more of a traditional hardware project, but it was basically about manufacturing contact lenses for an African population. So there was a study at UKZN about corneal profiles or eye profiles, and essentially a lot of people from non-Caucasian races struggle to find contact lenses that fit. So the initiative was to try and create a sort of contact lenses for African populations. So I don't know, I mean that's not something that I'm an expert in, but you can see some of the different types of projects. This was a maxilla distractor, which here is from Groote Schuur. Basically the use of transport distraction osteogenesis in the palate to close a defect. So you can see on that sort of this defect in the person's mouth has been pulled by this basically a little device that was that you turn by 1.5 millimeters per day. So it basically pulls the bone grows to close the gap rather than putting something plastic or something in the space. So very innovative device that won quite a few awards. They've done it on 4 patients at the moment, and so it seems to work quite well. So there's just a bit of an idea of the types of projects that can come out of academic environments. And each of these has got its own story. There were other projects as well, and you can see how varied the needs and the kind of the context of the different projects that you can have. So I think one of the take-home messages that I wanted to kind of explain a bit more about was, has anybody here worked sort of with an engineer and a doctor kind of in close contact? It's a very interesting experience. That one project which I didn't show, which was a telemedicine project, it had all clinicians and there weren't any engineers. There were no software engineers on the project. So they were outsourcing all of their software. And there was a big problem in that software development was very expensive and was running up, the bills were just going, and there was basically a problem with the payment for the software services. And it's just one example where when I came in and I said, well, so what is your specification? What are you trying to build? What is your, there was none. And they didn't have anybody technical on their side, basically, to check what these outside people were doing and to make sure that they weren't overcharging and that they weren't just asking for things which were not needed. So there was a real need for integrated team of engineers and doctors working together, especially not someone who was being paid as an outside consultant to come in and have a look once in a while. And what tends to happen is that people put down requirements like, yes, we wanted to do this. We wanted, in that case, we want medical grade software. So this company, without digging into too much detail, they said, okay, we want medical grade encryption. So then they went and they pulled, they look up what is medical grade encryption, which is some of the highest level encryption probably imaginable. And that's actually where all the costs were going. And if they come back and said, no, listen, this encryption is probably not that necessary in the South African context, they might have saved a lot of money. So there was very poor communication between the clinical team. They were physically removed from each other. One was in Stellenbosch, one was in Tygerberg. And a lot of potential for problems. And the Ambiflow at Doppler that had the opposite problem. That was a group of engineers who had basically been given the rubber stamp by a clinician who said, yes, of course we need that. We need to reduce the number of referrals by getting Doppler into a primary care setting. So that project was launched. They had endorsement letters from the clinician, etc., etc. That it was funded with a lot of enthusiasm in the early 2000s. Then ran out of funding. Basically, was put on the shelf. It was revived around 2005. Again, was had to halt because of lack of funding, and then was funded again more recently now with the CSR. The product is great, but there was no clinical person on the team. It was all engineers. And one of the challenges, we had a business development manager who worked in medical devices, and she came in, she said, where's your clinical case for this? And they were working with the same clinical case that they had 10 years ago. Saying things like, 9 out of 10, only 1 out of the 9 referrals is a necessary referral. The rest could be avoidable referrals. So we're using the stat, a very simple statistic from a long time ago. And they never questioned that. And she went in with this Excel spreadsheet, and literally within a week she had a clinical case of how many births are there in South Africa, which mothers would benefit from this technology, how would they benefit, how might it, obviously there's complications, and often the referrals are not because of placental insufficiency, it's for infection or other reasons, and that wasn't being captured. And the net effect, or the value to the user out of that analysis was but dramatically lower than what the engineers had assumed all along. So it's difficult, but you have to work together. That's the message that I wanted to make very clear, is that the teams, if they can't communicate almost on a social level, there mustn't be. You often get the case where a doctor is very busy and they say, yes, I really think that product should exist, and they come in once every few months and maybe say, yeah, good work, keep going, but never takes the time to really understand what is being delivered. The product comes out and they say, no, sorry, I don't need it, it doesn't suit my needs, and they're obviously not responsible for it. They just provided their clinical, but it was too superficial. Quite an interesting article which I distributed to some of the doctors when we were starting off the projects about this thing and how to get these teams to work. I think that from my point of view, if you are going to set up a project which is a new device that you want to develop, you need to nominate someone who's responsible for the project. They're not responsible for the engineering or for the medical, they're responsible as almost like a CEO or project manager. So basically they are responsible for how this project functions. And they're not going to be biased, they're going to actually take a step back from being biased by their background, which might be engineering, might be medicine, or might even be business. But that they can ask the tough questions and force people to make difficult decisions about what to develop and where to spend the money. Otherwise, huge amounts of money can be wasted. I mean, that piece of software I mentioned had reached about 2 million rand by the time I came along, and it had been rolled out to a whole lot of sites around South Africa, and was just, the usage was essentially zero. The nurses just said, we don't like the software. And yeah, so it's interesting case studies in themselves. So so I think if you dig one level deeper, you say, well, what is the difference between the way someone who's medically trained and someone who's trained in engineering? What's the difference in the way they think? Because there must be some differences, otherwise they would just make, they would work together very smoothly. I think one of the difficult ones is the aspect of time frame. The doctor, I think, is very familiar with things happening quite fast, and the patient comes in and we actually see to the patient. I mean, you might think it's a long time period, but the engineer is thinking in terms of years, not in terms of days or weeks. And so often the doctor is wanting to get a result very quickly. And sometimes at the expense of that first phase of looking at the problem in much more depth. And often that first phase of those 7 or those is very invisible. There's nothing, you don't see anything. But and the one investor said, spend your first year getting to the specification, which is phenomenal. Like he said, don't build anything. I mean, that's maybe debatable, but he said, don't build anything until you've got your specification, you're comfortable with it. Do some research, watch people, understand what the problem is. Don't build anything. But we started the project. Within a few weeks, everyone wanted to build us something, and then we'll know what we want. So there's a definite tension there in the time, and then also the time that the people have to spend. If there's a new feature that has to come in, the doctor might quickly look at the feature and say, yes, that's a good feature to add, but not quite understand the impact of that feature. And so that aspect of time, actually spending time with the product, with the design, and evaluating it in more depth, and using different tools, these process tools, to actually imagine what impact it's got to have. Because there's so many things that have to happen down the line. It must be rock solid in a design sense, because people must pay for it. There's so many risks coming up down the line, especially financial risks, that can scupper the project, that it must make perfect sense technically and from it clinically before you start taking it forward and throwing a lot of money down that road. So yeah, just to remember all the different people that are going to be interested in the product, the insurance companies, on this surgical product we worked on that we had to convince the Mediclinic that they should pay for it, that they should reimburse it. Unfortunately, they did. But when we went to Netcare, they said, sorry, we're not interested in reimbursing that product. So we couldn't sell to any of their surgeons. So you run into interesting little problems, and we said, why won't you accept this product? They didn't have a very good reason. Basically, they just said, no, we need to wait and see that more gets sold. So you get this catch-22. They say, well, we need to see that your sales figures, but they're one of your biggest customers, so you can't move forward. So there's lots of risks coming up down the track. I think the aspect of language is quite important. The way you describe something, the way you sketch something, the way you interact is just something that must always be kept in mind. And something like a word specification doesn't get used in a clinical setting very much. But if a doctor understands what the engineer is trying to get at, maybe he'll see past just a piece of paper, which can be very boring, and see why is the specification so crucial. And it's basically that it's that smallest point of contact between the different pieces of people in the team that say, we at least as of this date we agreed on this. So it's a central agreement which helps to reduce the amount of I thought you were doing this, I thought you were doing this, I thought it was going to have this feature, I thought it was, all those kinds of fights which can come up down the line. The financial aspect, to develop a new medical device or piece of software, 1 to 2 million is sort of the starting range. And it sounds like a lot of money. And then if you start to think about the cost of clinical care, and you start to think about doctors' times and all of that sort of thing, you realize it's not actually such a lot of money in that context. You just need to understand it's a different kind of financial environment compared to normal clinical budgeting and all of that. I think those are all the main things. I don't know how much time we've got, but I thought I'll just finish off with a bit of industry stuff, just to give you an idea if you actually are thinking of going into this. I think because we in South Africa and we came from a very sanctions kind of mentality, you can see it quite a lot in the design world. People are saying, "I'll do it myself. I'm not going to go and." So they make very good technical designs, but the translation to the outside world is actually quite poor. So the business side of things is often where things are lacking. And so I think if you want to get into this sort of space, if you're in a clinical environment, you need to think about your time. Am I willing to give up? One of the emergency medicine doctors now has given up 100% of his clinical time. He's not doing any clinical work. He's just working on the product. He at first thought, no, you can do 1 day a week. And you realize, no, it should just kind of snowball. And you need to realize that it's a very different time commitment. I think what's so important is that we think about the South African context. So we've got different disease burdens, we've got different technology expertise, and if we don't leverage off that, we don't have much of a chance against the number of companies that are in Europe and the US. So we need to make sure that we have local knowledge which is superior in some way to, and maybe our teams are working better together. I think we have good contact. I mean, the fact that we've got biomedical engineering on campus, on the medical campus, is fantastic, because you run into medical people all the time. So I think there's some really good advantages. I'll just jump through a couple of industry buzzwords. Are there any questions at this point? Sorry, yeah, Richard.
I've just got one, Giovanni. So you mentioned in the beginning that the software companies and the healthcare innovation coming out of the software development has got a lot faster turnover, and by and large they don't have to go through the same kind of regulatory processes as the device industry. It was just quite interesting hearing Jishan's talk a couple of weeks ago, and one of the big issues that came out was this whole idea of where's healthcare information being stored. And now just looking at how that's being progressed, don't you think that we should start implementing those kind of regulatory needs into the software development side of healthcare innovation that has been so ingrained within product development?
Yeah, there's a big realization from a regulatory point of view with regards to software which is attached to a device. So when you've got a piece of software, like let's say you've got an MRI scanner and you've got the software which comes along, that in terms of regulatory point of view, those two things are regulated together, which is really difficult for the software designers because they can't make any changes. That software is very, it has to be frozen so that the regulator can check it, basically. Because you can't go and change even where a button is on the screen. You've got to just keep everything as it is. And then you need to leave it like that for the regulator to look at, which can take a year, 2 years, to go through the regulatory process. So that's obviously on the high end. On the software and on the health record side of things, I think the best thing is just to keep the standards in mind. So the HL7 is the one that's quite, and you know about the ICD codes, ICD-10 at this stage. So I think I don't know enough about the regulations in South Africa, but the regulations in general are not very good in South Africa. They're not very, we don't have very comprehensive regulations. And about medical software particularly, there's not a lot of regulations. So you've got a lot of policy or like statements government officials saying, no, this is how it should be, but the implementation and the actual way that they check if those are implemented is very, I don't know, I haven't come across a lot of that going on. So I think a lot of it is up to you, and I think as a designer you run a huge risk if you don't implement those standards, because you basically with one failure and you can be out of business. One patient's, if somebody who's got sensitive information, that information gets out to the public, and things can go bad very, very quickly. So I think that's often the hidden cost. Maybe that example I gave about the medical grade encryption, maybe it was good just to have too much encryption. Just don't take any chances. But the level that they were using is like security, intelligence agency, spy kind of level of security on that. So you say, well, is that, at what level do you just encrypt it on the device? Do you have to encrypt the communications? All those kinds of questions. And that's where having a technical person in your team, even if they just come in once a week, if they're senior, you might not be able to afford them full time, but rather get someone you trust that is on your side, so that when all these companies, I mean the one example, we had 7 different companies that were bidding for this task, and every proposal is different. They say, one says we want to use this file format, one says, it gets very confusing. And to sort through that doesn't help to just get more and more suggestions. You actually have to technically sift through those quotes, and it's really, really tough. Sure, thanks. Any others? Okay, well, I can just let you know what's happening a little bit more in the industry. This concept of frugal innovation, and in the UK and Europe, and not even to mention the USA, healthcare costs are growing much faster than inflation, and so there's a big push to try and contain costs. And they're saying, well, so how do we develop products for it cheaply, basically, and maintain the safety standards? So this concept of frugal innovation. So I actually went to a conference to speak in Brussels about frugal innovations, to say, what is happening in Africa? They said, well, you guys have been developing products in a cost-constrained, with no money for a long time. How do you do it? I mean, I couldn't really answer all those questions, but it's just interesting that there's this interest now in how do you design on a very, very tight budget. And I think the issue of safety is a big one, because the same product, when you're wanting to check how safe it is, you can check it 10 times, you can check it 100 times. How will you know when it's absolutely safe? And that cost can just keep going. If someone says, what happens if it bursts into flames? Now you've got to test that. It's just, the thing, you can just see it can snowball. The amount of costs to develop a device just can go through the roof. So I think in South Africa we've got a good pragmatic kind of approach of balancing risk and reward, and I think that's something we can use. Task shifting is often not difficult word, but basically the idea of the skills mix. That's also an NHS talk that I was listening to, basically about which skill sets are being used in the use of this device. So if you think about the user, some of them are very well trained, and some might be community health workers. And you've got to think very, what are they being trained in? How much training will it take to get that person to be able to use this device? If the training is too much, then your device won't be taken. So I think that skills mix in South Africa, especially when you add ethnography to the mix. So language, people's socioeconomic backgrounds, the actual workers using these devices. There's obviously a trend in the developed world towards personalized, predictive, preventive, participatory medicine, and there's this massive revolution going on in medicine, which you can look into. But basically, people are taking more control of their own healthcare rather than trusting the medical system, and trying to do more preventative healthcare. So the whole Google your health needs type of world. SAMED is the medical device regulator, or not regulator, industry body up in Johannesburg, and they've done a great job of communicating the regulations. So if you're interested in who are the local companies that are out there, what are they doing, you can get a list of local companies. I can give you that. There's about 80 sort of local medical devices companies in South Africa that you can look through and see what they're doing. Some are doing everything from bone marrow transplants and orthopaedic devices all the way across to audiometers, etc. So I can give you that information. Interestingly, this Directorate of Radiation Control in Bellville is actually the group that's responsible for regulating electrical devices. And at the moment, they just say we need CE mark on everything we develop, and they don't actually provide much more than that. SABS does the testing of medical devices like condoms and sort of the bulk medical devices, more the mechanical ones, not so much electrical ones. And the WHO has actually been doing some good work in, and I'll just maybe flip through some more slides. This is the WHO project on priority medical devices. What is actually needed in different countries around the world. And they call it managing the mismatch, because a lot of devices that get sold are not appropriate for the needs. So they've got this innovation page, looking at different ways of doing, looking after, for maternal care, rehabilitation. There's a pulse oximeter there, and each country has got its own reference in terms of policies, contact people, health technology assessments, all those kinds of things. So if you're interested in that. And then these background papers are quite nice to identify gaps, what devices are actually needed in your country, what processes, how do you deal with more complexity in our current high and low resource settings. So you can see there's a lot of work being done out in the field. And then I just wanted to mention SHIP, which is at the MRC, the recent funding for product development, and I would encourage you to watch the calls for funding if you want to develop a product. I think the maternal, mother and child health one is coming out soon, the non-communicable diseases. Several, anyway, they're being very well funded internationally, and they're probably your best friend in terms of getting started right at the early stage of it's basically the big brother of what I work for. But they're very keen to find out how we can address the South African burden of disease. You can see their drugs. I mean, I'm going to talk more about medical devices, but you've got drugs and diagnostics. Diagnostics is especially interesting because the regulations are actually are much more lenient in that world. As long as you can show that it's providing a certain level of accuracy, it's a lot easier to develop diagnostics than to develop devices, because you're not interacting with the patient directly. You're taking a sample and then you're dealing with it away from the patient. So the regulations are and so they're putting quite a lot of money into especially TB diagnostics, those kinds of things, point of care devices, which I think is very exciting. If anybody's interested in that side of things, it's quite exciting. A whole lot of areas of support, although this is now the finance has gone up by a factor of 10, and basically pre-commercial prototyping. You can just see the burdens of disease and then the technologies that can address them. And there's a whole matrix of interactions of what technology can we use. Can we use, say, a circumcision device to address HIV, for instance? There's a different connection which is not normally thought of. Whereas traditionally we think of a drug to treat HIV. Maybe we can reduce transmission, all these kinds of things. So trying to look at the interactions there. And that's just the normal pipeline of how you get a product to market. You can look further into that. So that's basically it. Thank you, guys.